An analysis of household consumption trends shows that on average, Kenyans can no longer live on their income and have resorted to draining their savings to survive. For more than 3 years now, Kenyans have been spending more than they earn, exposing themselves to increasing onerous debt burden, a Nation Newsplex review of government consumption data reveals.
And this data refers to the last 3 years, and that season, if I may call it that, coincided with a season in which the oil prices were very high. Because of that, some goods and services that Kenyans consume mainly became much more expensive than they'd been previously. So what that means is with income not growing as fast as inflation and other things, Kenyans were constrained, or some households were constrained in terms of what they could buy for stagnant incomes.
Presents a very significant problem to themselves because it means that they are actually eating into their own financial future. It's always a trade-off between eating today or eating tomorrow. So whenever maybe someone is earning 10,000 and they are spending 15, that 5,000 has actually come from the future. And that means that even for the economy in general, people have started maybe borrowing to sustain such habits, and it has a massive impact.
Data from the 2016 economic survey, which was published in May, shows the consumption rate was 102% of income in 2013, 103% in 2014, and 102% in 2015.
So how do Kenyans cope? You can cope by borrowing, which means you're consuming into the future, or as some of that data suggests to us, what most people did was that if you had savings prior, then it's those savings that you're consuming. So you've brought back savings that you've made, you've actually saved by topping up your income with previous year's savings to ensure that you're able to afford the same things that you did previously.
Consumption is the amount of money spent on goods and services, not including investments. When consumption goes above 100% of income, it means that people are not saving any money but are spending what they had saved earlier or borrowing to make ends meet. The data was analyzed in collaboration with the Institute of Economic Affairs, IEA.
Aggregate savings actually reflect both savings at the public sector and at the household level. Government also was running very big deficits. If you remember, 6-7% of GDP in terms of deficits is not really a small amount. It's quite a bit of money. So it means that at the household level, there was pressure for people to spend more than there's pressure on incomes, and then government was also spending much more than what it collected in revenues. So obviously that leads to net national savings having reduced.
A comparison of savings to borrowing data from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics reveals this very clearly. On one hand, net national borrowing accelerated from 190 billion shillings in 2010 to 579 billion shillings in 2015. On the other hand, savings rose from 83 billion shillings in 2010 to 121 billion shillings in 2011, but then plummeted below zero from 2013 onwards. The data is saying we risk being trapped by debt.
It's clear, and you can see in this year's budget estimates that were presented to Parliament at the end of April, at the beginning of May, one of the first things that you're seeing is for the first time in almost 10 years, we're actually paying more, though it's only for a year, we are paying more in interest on our loans than we're actually paying in the principal, which means that you're paying more in accumulated interest than you're paying in terms of redeeming the loan. If that persists, we'd be in big trouble. So far, it seems to be an uneven keel. So if we don't borrow some more, and revenues come in and growth takes place, then we will not necessarily have a big problem. But on the whole, we have a much bigger debt burden than we've ever had at any time in Kenya's life.
Thought here is for us to start gaining back a culture of investing so that we can build the broader economy. Investing is whereby you're actually growing the money in the economy, as opposed to consumption where everything is driven by consumption, which to some extent also yields debt, because that's how people actually end up funding their consumption.
The problem with borrowing and using savings for consumption is that, unlike investment, consumption has no returns. Institute of Economic Affairs CEO Kwame Owino says the de-saving was probably driven by high oil prices, which then created a rise in cost of living. If wages are stagnant, then people need much more money to afford the same things such as food and other necessities, he says.
Most debt at household level tends to be the debt that goes from either from banks more often, or people de-saving. So as conditions improve, one of the first things that happens is, for some businesses, if you borrowed for a business purpose and it went bad, I think one of the things that happens is often you're liquidated. So the bank absorbs that cost, which of course is spread among other people. So you see interest rates going up and down. So I think banks have it, and with the more prudence by the by the governor, as you saw, some of the borrowing is actually not a small household borrowing, it's big corporations and a few people who are connected to banks who borrow, who may provide a systemic risk. But I think it's been observed, as you can tell, many more banks are declaring bigger non-performing loans based on the fact that they gave some loans and they're not able to recover, so they may liquidate a few businesses and then it will resolve itself. But what happens is we all pay for it by a higher interest rate. So if you take both together, I don't think Kenya is in a big risk. Some sectors are more at risk than others, but overall, I don't think we had a big risk of a big credit default.
The average consumption per person rose from about 60,000 shillings per year in 2010 to 70,000 shillings in 2015, reveals an analysis of data from the Economic Survey 2016. This is an overall growth rate of 17% in the 5-year period, or about 2.8% per year. At first sight, this does not appear bad. However, when compared to the gross domestic product GDP, that is, the value of goods and services produced in the country, it turns out that consumption has been growing faster than GDP. The data shows that per capita consumption was 76% of GDP in 2010, and this ratio increased steadily to about 80% from 2013 onwards. Obviously, it is desirable to have consumption lower than GDP, but the narrowing of the gap is worrying. Furthermore, compared to the more vibrant economies of the world, a consumption rate of 80% of GDP is quite high. Global data from the World Bank shows that in the same period, Brazil's consumption rate rose from 60% to 63%, while in Russia, it rose from 48% to 53%. India's rate fluctuated from 57% to 59%. China saw its rate fall from 38% to 37%, while South Africa's rate rose from 60% to 61%. Unlike these so-called BRICS nations, consumption ranged between 54% and 59% in the more mature economies of Europe and North America. So, it's quite clear that Kenyans are consuming too much. A look at World Bank data by Newsplex and IEA also shows that in Africa, Botswana had the lowest consumption as a proportion of GDP, 46% in 2014. Liberia's 134% was the highest rate, both in Africa and the world. In the East African community, Kenya consumes a higher proportion of GDP than her neighbors. Consumption in Tanzania slowed down from 68% of GDP in 2011 to 65% in 2014, while in Uganda it varied slightly from 75% to 74%. In Rwanda, it fell from 78% to 74%, while rising in Burundi from 72% to 77%.